Come on there, please. Thank you. Okay. In terms of your job, you said that you were very much based at home and you had a van, which was almost your office, so to speak. Can you give some information about the location? So first of all, why you were in the situation where it was you with the van rather than you working in an office, and then also the central office itself and its location and reasons for that.
So the reason why we were largely based from home with our van as our office was because the areas that each individual technician covered were very large. So my area when I started, I live in Blandford and lived in Blandford then, but I would go to Devon, Cornwall, Gloucestershire, South Wales, leaving from my home and returning to my home every day. But there were other technicians who overlapped with my area but also covered the rest of the south of England. So it was impossible to always start in one place, all technicians, because you had such large distance to travel. However, we did have a head office, our main building, which was actually in Bournemouth, and that main building was where supplies were delivered to. So every time I needed supplies, I would have to go to that office to collect more supplies. That was also where the admin function was, so all the phone numbers, all the booking staff, all the people who sorted out billing, and the general manager were based there. So if there was any face-to-face communication that had to happen, I had to go to Bournemouth for that.
Can you explain, why do you think they put it in Bournemouth? Why Bournemouth rather than any of the other places where in the area that you covered? The location, Bournemouth, really was because the person who started the company lived in Bournemouth. And so the business grew from Bournemouth rather than the other way around, rather than placing Bournemouth afterwards. So it was a case of, we're in Bournemouth, we're in the south of England, where should we go to do our work? We'll go in the local area. So the first few contracts when the company was set up in 1980-something were in Bournemouth and Poole. And then gradually, as the business grew, contracts were won in Weymouth and Southampton, and it expanded from there. And then eventually, of course, you end up with an area which is as big as it was. So how important to the running of the organisation was the location of that office? Did it disadvantage some of the other technicians because they were much further away than you were? Because obviously that's not too far for you. But in terms of where they were, did it disadvantage them, and actually how much of an impact on their day-to-day work did it make?
Yeah, so as the company grew, and in fact I was working for them for 11 years, and over that time they 10 times the size by the time I left. And when I started, it was relatively easy for me to get to Bournemouth, only being at Blandford. But by the time I left, we had technicians who lived in Plymouth, we had technicians who lived in north of London, we had technicians who lived in Gloucestershire. Now for them to get to Bournemouth was a 2 or 3 hour drive, impossible to do really on a daily basis. So we ended up setting up regional offices, there was one in Basingstoke to cover the London area, there was another one in Exeter to cover the southwest. They were not like the head office because most of the admin staff stayed there, but they did have a supply facility so we could get things delivered to those locations, and often the managers of that area would have an office in that space. So it was easier for people to get, and you were always trying to keep journey times to a minimum because of course travelling is very expensive, and so having people travel a long way just to get to one place and then drive back again was very inefficient, not a very good way of running a business.
We could move on now to talking about actually the effect of your job or the industry that you worked in on society. Could you explain and identify and explain some of those effects that you think your job had on society, and actually how important you think the impact was?
Okay, so when I was a technician, often you would be going in to solve somebody's problem, which of course is a great way of going into a situation. They had an issue, they definitely couldn't solve it themselves. Sometimes the issue was causing them some great distress. So in the summer months, for example, people have wasps, and wasps of course are very unpleasant. I remember having one, a wasp nest had established in the roof above a clinic in a hospital,
and the clinic had to shut because the wasps were interfering with the patients. And until I arrived and disposed of that nest, nothing could continue, so everything stopped. So on a small scale, often we were going in and we were effectively the person who was going to resolve the pressing issue for those people at that time. On a larger scale, certainly when we were dealing with big factories in the food industry, us getting rid of pests in a food factory was important, A, for the business, because it enabled them to continue selling products that were safe, but also important, obviously, for their customers, because it meant that people were eating things which had not been contaminated. And of course, that was a big public health concern. So we had a very important role in ensuring that food safety was maintained.
Which part of all of that, all of the impacts you mentioned, which part do you think is, if you had to single one out as being the most important impact that you made, and why you think it is?
So I think probably I would focus on food safety. In fact, towards the end of my time there, I ended up training all of our staff in food safety. So I ended up with some food hygiene qualifications, and I was responsible for educating people in what bacteria might be present and how to get rid of them and all of that. And so through that process of education, which both I and the company were doing, many small businesses particularly were learning things in an environment that was not so threatening, as if when an environmental health officer goes in, they find an issue. If it's a very significant issue, they may well close that premises down. And so we were able to offer a service before it got to that stage. And for many businesses, that was the difference between them closing or surviving. So that was quite important.
Brilliant. Okay, can we stop there?